All right, so in today's video is going to be a little more informal. I'm just going to take you through the process of how I use AI to try to brainstorm and generate ideas for a new theory. In this case, I'm going to be taking a look at did Paul write the Pauline Epistles? I recently came to the opinion that he did not, and so I'm just exploring that idea. If you're familiar with my channel, you'll know that I've previously done a video on why I think the Apostle Paul was the Egyptian that is mentioned in the book of Acts, as well as Josephus. And I also did a video on why I think he died on his way to Rome. Initially, I thought that although Paul was the Egyptian revolutionary, that he did perhaps convert to Christianity at a later date, but then his past caught up to him. However, as I've been studying some other characters in the New Testament, such as Peter and Apollo, these were people that were expecting a Messiah figure, but they did not believe that Messiah figure was Jesus. And so it appears that much of the New Testament is trying to assimilate those followers into the Jesus movement. And I think verses like Matthew 24:5, where it talks about how many will say, "I am the Christ," is addressing that issue, as well as in 1 Corinthians, where it talks about how some said that they belong to Paul, and some belong to Apollos, and some belong to Cephas. So if Paul was never a follower of Jesus, then all of his epistles were forgeries. I also did a series on 1 Thessalonians where I reconstructed what Paul's opponents were teaching, and that his letters were essentially responding to the teachings of his opponents. However, it appears more and more to me that those letters were forged, and that the author of those forged letters were actually responding to Paul's original teachings. Which is just wild to think about. It's a whole new paradigm. It's one that I'm still trying to comprehend. And it's actually difficult to read through the Pauline epistles in that light, because for so long I've read them as being written by Paul. And so I think that these Pauline epistles are the greatest propaganda ever written. And if it hadn't been for the book of Acts, where I could reconstruct who Paul really was originally, I don't think I ever would have detected that the Pauline epistles were propaganda. So when I start exploring a new idea, I've been using AI for a while now. Typically, I've used ChatGPT, sometimes Perplexity, but recently I've been using Grok. I like Grok because it seems a little more able to think outside the box, which I typically like to do in my work. So here are some of the observations of AI that I've noticed as I've used it in my work. One is that it provides a pretty balanced view. One of the criticisms of AI is that whatever you ask it for, it tries to provide that for you, and in those cases, it does tend to be unbalanced. But in my experience, I'll give it a theory to explore, and it will explore that theory, but it also will raise some objections to it. The information that it's pulling from tends to be consensus view. So, and I tend to go against the consensus. And so I think it's a little more natural for AI to push back on some of my proposals. Another observation is that it does have difficulty thinking outside of the box. So like I said, it's drawing usually from consensus information, and it can be difficult to try to jar it out of that way of thinking to consider something new. It is very good, however, at listing data, not just listing verses with certain words, but I'll ask it to list verses based on an idea or a concept, and it will list verses that typical word search would not catch. And I think it's better as more of a soundboard than providing substance. It's good for helping you explore new ideas more than it is at generating new ones. So I see AI as more of a starting point than I do as an ending point. All right, so I just want to take you through this conversation I had with Grok about this theory. So I start off by telling it to assume that Paul was the Egyptian mentioned in Acts and Josephus, and that Paul's letters are forgeries that are trying to convince us he was not. And it starts off by giving us some background content. Then in step 1, comparing Paul and the Egyptian. The timelines match up, so it's possible. And the profile says the Egyptian was a messianic revolutionary leading an armed group. Here it calls them Sicarii or Daggermen. The book of Acts calls them assassins. Paul in Acts and his letters is a preacher, not a military leader. However, Paul's zeal as a Pharisee persecuting Christians and his later fervor could hint at a radical streak. So right away, it's having difficulty distinguishing between what's forged in the letters and what is actually Paul. And then it points out why Paul might have been mistaken for the Egyptian. Both were in Jerusalem, both had followers, and both stirred up crowds. Step 2 just reviews Paul's letters. All right, and then this is good. It's looking for a motive for the forgery. It says, if Paul was a revolutionary Egyptian, early Christians might have wanted to sanitize his image to appeal to Roman authorities and Jewish communities, distancing him from sedition. The letters emphasize his Roman citizenship, theological focus, and nonviolence. All right, and then it talks about content clues in Galatians 1:13-24. Paul defends his past, claiming he was a Pharisee who persecuted Christians before converting. This could be a forged backstory to counter rumors of a revolutionary past. Similarly, 1 Corinthians 9:19-23, I became all things to all people, might mask a chameleon-like adaptability suited to a rebel leader. I don't think that's why it says he became all things to all people. I think Paul was an Egyptian who was a Jewish convert and therefore followed the Jewish law. And so the forgers, the biblical writers, had to come up with an explanation for why he did that. And that explanation is he became all things to all people. And one thing I should note here is that the epistles were not written directly to Paul's followers, because the propaganda wouldn't work in that case. They would have been too familiar with who Paul was. So we would have been looking at a generation past the followers of the original followers of Paul. So in that case, they would be familiar with Paul, but not directly. And so they would become a little more malleable, and propaganda techniques like this in the Pauline epistles would be more effective. And so that also means that the Pauline epistles were written at a much later date. All right, and then comes the challenges to the hypothesis. So this is the more balanced view that I mentioned earlier. So it talks about how Paul was a Jew from Tarsus, where the Egyptian was an Egyptian. But like I said before, I don't think Paul was actually a Jew from Tarsus. I think that's a cover story in the epistles or in Acts. And that's another thing that Grok initially has a hard time understanding, is that Acts is also propaganda. Then it talks about the scale. The Egyptian led thousands. Paul's groups in Acts are smaller. I'm not concerned about numbers. Numbers tend to vary a lot in ancient sources. And theology versus rebellion. Paul's letters focus on Christ's resurrection, grace, and faith. Hardly the stuff of a Sicarii leader. And again, it's having a hard time distinguishing between the real Paul and what the forgers were injecting their theology into Paul's voice. And so that's where the resurrection and grace and faith come from. That would not have been in Paul, of course, if he was a revolutionary leader like the Egyptian. All right, and then step 4, a speculative narrative. It titles this and then says, let's imagine Paul, an Egyptian Jew or Hellenized figure, leads a failed revolt against Rome, escapes, and later reinvents himself as a Christian missionary. So again, they were having a hard time distinguishing between who Paul really was and the agenda of the forgers of the epistles. All right, and so the next prompt that I do is I say, no, Paul did not reinvent himself as a Christian missionary, but the forgers did in order to assimilate his following into Christianity. So it responds by, got it, your hypothesis shifts the narrative. Paul doesn't pivot to Christianity himself. Instead, after his stint as the Egyptian revolutionary, others co-opt his legacy through forged letters to fold his followers into the emerging Christian movement. Let's run with this and flesh it out. All right, so I think it's getting more on track here. Then it provides a revised framework. Paul as the Egyptian. So Paul leads the revolt described by Josephus and referenced in Acts 21:38, messianic, militant, anti-Roman. He escapes Felix's crackdown, but his movement persists, a mix of Jewish zealots and disaffected followers awaiting his return or next move. Good, that's very good. No conversion. Unlike Acts story, the Damascus Road, Acts 9, Paul never becomes a Christian, That's a later fabrication. Very good. That's right on track. He remains a revolutionary figure, perhaps in hiding or dead by the late 50s CE. So in my previous video, I lay out why I think Paul died in the shipwreck on his way to Rome. The forger's agenda. Early Christian leaders, say post 70 CE, after Jerusalem's fall, see Paul's following as a ripe target for assimilation. His charisma, organization skills, and radical energy could bolster Christianity, but only if reframed. They craft letters and a backstory to transform him into a Christian apostle. So that's great. Really on target here. How it might have worked. The letters as tools. The authentic Pauline epistles could be forgeries from scratch, written by a single author or group familiar with Jewish theology and Greco-Roman rhetoric. They invent a Paul who's a Pharisee, converts dramatically, and preaches Christ crucified. The goal to convince Paul's followers, already primed for a messianic figure, that their leader's mission was fulfilled in Jesus, not an armed revolt. Romans 13:1-7, submit to governing authorities, directly contradicts a revolutionary ethos, nudging the group toward pacifism and integration. So that's really good, I think. And then it talks about Acts as propaganda. This is great. I didn't tell it that Acts was propaganda. It kind of comes up with that on its own. It says the book of Acts, likely written late first century, weaves Paul into the Christian narrative. The Tribune's question might be a sly nod to the truth, a rumor the author couldn't fully suppress. But Paul's denial and Roman citizenship paint him as loyal and safe. The Damascus Road in Acts 9 becomes the linchpin, a miraculous conversion no one can verify, conveniently explaining why Paul's followers should switch allegiances. So it's really getting on track here, I think. Motive, post-70 CE, with the temple gone and Jewish resistance crushed, Christianity is distancing itself from Judaism and Rome's wrath. All right, evidence and gaps, textual hints. The epistle's obsession with Paul's credentials could be overcompensation by forgers addressing doubts about his Jewishness or past. Paul avoiding Jerusalem apostles might hint at a figure who never joined the Christian inner circle because he didn't. I think that's spot on. Historical fit. The Egyptians' revolt predates the letter's traditional dating, but if all are forgeries, they could have been written later, say 70s to 90s CE, when Christianity needed numbers and legitimacy. Challenges. The letter's theological coherence and personal details, example, Philemon's intimacy, suggest either a genius forger or some basis in a real Paul. And so, like I've said before, I think it's a genius forger. Like I said, I think it's the best propaganda ever written. And then it says, plus, why pick an Egyptian revolutionary? A blank slate apostle might have been easier to invent. But a blank slate apostle would not have an existing following. And so I think that's the key, why they chose to sanitize Paul. So it comes up with this new scenario. Paul the Egyptian leads his revolt, fails and fades, killed or fugitive. His followers, scattered but loyal, cling to his messianic vision. Decades later, Christian scribes, perhaps in Ephesus or Rome, hear of this group and see an opportunity. They forge letters blending Jewish zeal with Christology, claiming Paul saw Jesus as the true Messiah. Acts follows. I'm not sure Acts does follow. I think it may have predated the epistles. But anyway, Acts follows, cementing the myth. The real Paul's Sicarii ties are buried. His followers, persuaded or confused, merge into the church. I think that's a great summary. All right, and so the next prompt that I do, I say, good, you're getting it. Analyze Paul as a prophet, the prophet that was the Egyptian. Examine biblical text in that light, and mention Paul as a prophet or having a revelation. So I'm saying this because I don't see Paul as seeing himself as a Messiah, but that he was a prophet and that he was predicting that a Messiah would come. Josephus refers to the Egyptian as a prophet, or as someone who's thought of himself as a prophet. And so I want to see if Grok can come up with some instances in the epistles that put Paul into that reference Paul in a prophetic light, or had a Paul that has some prophetic aspects to it. It's already mentioned the road to Damascus. And off the top of my head, I was able to think of the instance in, I think, 2 Corinthians, where it talks about how he went to the third heaven. So I'm hoping it will expand on those, and then maybe it'll come up with some other instances as well. So it responds, all right, let's dive into Paul as the Egyptian prophet, not a Christian apostle, but the revolutionary figure from Josephus in Acts 21:38, whose identity was later hijacked by forgers. We'll examine biblical texts that depict Paul as a prophet or receiving revelations, reinterpreting them as reflections of his original role as a messianic prophetic leader before the Christian overlay was imposed. So it does mention the Damascus Road vision again, mentions the traditional view, and then with the Egyptian prophet lens, it says, if Paul was Egyptian, this story is a forgery overlaying a real event. Perhaps he did have a vision common for prophets, but not of Jesus. Imagine a theophany tied to his revolt, a call from God to lead Israel against Rome, misinterpreted or rewritten by Christians. The blinding light and voice could echo Moses' burning bush, or Elijah's encounters, reframed to pivot his mission toward Christ. The forgers insert Jesus to claim his prophetic authority for their cause. So that's good. All right, then it mentions this scene in Acts 13 where the sorcerer is blinded. In this case, I think it's more about the sorcerer than it is about Paul. So I'm not gonna read too much into that, but I will revisit that later. Then it mentions 2 Corinthians 12, his visions and revelations. Lists the traditional view, and then for the Egyptian prophetic lens, it says, this screams prophetic experience. Think Ezekiel visions or Isaiah's throne room encounter. If forged, it's a clever twist. Paul's real revelation might have been a call to liberate Jerusalem, not a Christian rapture. The thorn in the flesh could symbolize his failure as the Egyptian, defeat by Felix, recast as humility by forgers to downplay his militancy. I don't know about the thorn in the flesh. Thorn in the flesh could have just been the Romans. I don't know. It's an interesting take. And then we have Galatians 1, where it talks about how Paul's gospel was not man's gospel, but came through a revelation of Jesus Christ. The Egyptian prophet lens says, strip away Jesus Christ, and this fits a prophet's profile. Direct divine communication, bypassing human authority. Arabia might hint at his escape after the revolt. I think that's very interesting. Not a missionary trip. The forgers retrofit this to make his revelation Christian, but originally it could have been God's command to lead the revolt, explaining his zeal and isolation from Jerusalem's establishment. And then it talks about this instance involving Agabus, where he ties the hands and feet of Paul. It takes it as a garbled echo of his prophetic status. I don't think that's the case. I think Agabus actually did bind. I think Agabus was the one that arrested Paul, and it actually did bind his feet and hands and led him to the authorities in his eventual demise. All right, so reinterpreting Paul's prophetic identity, core traits. Across these texts, Paul is depicted with prophetic hallmarks, vision, divine voices, symbolic acts, and authority over followers. This aligns with the Egyptian's profile, a charismatic leader, promising supernatural deliverance. The forgers spin. They keep the prophetic flavor, but redirect it. Instead of a Moses-like liberator toppling Rome, Paul becomes a herald of spiritual salvation through Jesus. The Egyptian's Mount of Olives stunt is erased, replaced with sermons and miracles. What's buried? The real Paul's revelations likely fueled his revolt, visions of God's kingdom breaking in, not Christ's resurrection. His gospel was liberation, his church a rebel band. The Sicarii connections hints at this, but the forgers scrub it clean. So it concludes, if Paul was the Egyptian prophet, these texts are a brilliant con job. I think that's very true. His prophetic DNA, revelations, authority signs shines through, but the Christian veneer hides his true mission, a Jewish uprising against Rome. The forgers take a firebrand and make him a saint, assimilating his followers by rewriting his divine encounters. And so I think that's all good. I think this is a good theory. I'm going to explore this more. Like I said, this is This is good just for initial exploration. I'm going to have to dig into the text itself, read through the Pauline epistles, and try to form some good arguments for this theory. So hopefully sometime in the future I'll be posting more about the Pauline epistles. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.